I know Professor McAuliffe already went over the effect of temperature on crop plants, and there's a bunch of different effects there. I just want to go over or repeat a couple of the more important ones for cropping system productivity. And the first is the effect of soil temperature on imbition, germination, and emergence. And the bottom line here is that the colder the soil temperature is, the longer these processes take, the longer it takes for that seed to emerge out of the ground. And the longer that emergence process takes, then the more likely it is that we're going to have yield reducing stresses. For example, we can have more seed predation by soil animals the longer that this emergence process takes. We can have chilling injury depending on the temperature of the moisture of the water being imbibed by that seed. And so ideally we want warm enough temperatures to ensure rapid and again even emergence. Aside from soil temperature having these effects on crop development, right, ambition, germination, and emergence, it also impacts growth. And specifically, it's going to impact root growth. And generally, colder soil temperatures are going to reduce the rate of root extension, and it's going to slow down how fast that plant and that crop can explore the soil, and gather in nutrients and water. So here these are graphs of cucumber and mustard, so not field crops, but I just thought these were really nice graphs to show you. On the x-axis are days, so I guess days from the start of root extension, and on the y-axis is root extension in millimeters. And you can see that, especially at lower soil temperatures, it depends on the crop, right? Each crop has a different optimum soil temperature, but as those temperatures get lower, root extension is also inhibited. And when we have a lower root extension rate in those colder soil temperatures, that means that the crop is going to take a much longer time to fully explore that soil profile. So it's going to take longer for that crop to reach nutrients and water and take those up. Whereas in a warmer soil with higher root extension rates, that crop can more fully and more quickly access the nutrients and water in that soil. Another important impact that soil temperature has is on soil microbial metabolism. So many nutrients like nitrogen and sulfur are essentially made available to plants via microbial processes. That's called mineralization. You'll learn more about that in your soil science class. But essentially, colder soils have lower rates of mineralization, and therefore they supply or provision lower levels of nitrogen and sulfur and other nutrients because decomposition rates and mineralization rates are much slower and lower in colder soil conditions. Soil temperature also impacts via physical processes nutrient uptake. For example, the temperature of water is going to influence the solubility of several minerals, including phosphate. Temperature also impacts root membrane permeability. So the bottom line is that the physical processes that help govern nutrient uptake in crops benefit, so to speak, from warmer soil temperatures. Soil temperature impacts cropping system management in temperate areas in a couple of ways, and I'll mention two. So the first would be planting date. So farmers have an incentive to plant as early as possible, right? By planting early, you essentially extend the effective length of the growing season. You allow that crop to intercept and absorb more radiation and have a higher yield potential. So that there's always a benefit to planting early that a farmer has to balance with the risk that soil temperature is too cold when they're planting, or that it's going to get colder, a couple days after planting, and then risk a cold-induced seed or seedling injury. Soil temperature also influences the benefits associated with starter fertilizer. And starter fertilizer is basically a management practice where low amounts of nutrients, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, are placed very close to the seed, either in the seed trench or 2 inches or so away from the seed trench. And this is called starter fertilizer because you're just placing a low amount of those nutrients just to help give that crop what you would say is a head start. And the logic behind starter fertilizer is that, look, in Canada, we have colder soil temperatures. Low soil temperatures mean low root extension rates. Remember that slide I showed you just previously. And with low root extension rates, it's going to take a lot longer for that crop to fully explore the soil profile. So how about we place nutrients right beside the seed so that the roots will very quickly encounter those nutrients and take them up? That is starter fertilizer. Okay. And in Canada, this is a very, 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 very common practice, applying starter fertilizer, low rates at planting, close to the seed. When I speak to my colleagues in Indiana, in Iowa, other parts of the United States, the Midwest, this is not common at all. Starter fertilizer is just not common. And this most likely has to do with soil temperatures in those regions around planting, right? The benefits of starter fertilizer are almost directly linked to latitude. In other words, areas where the soil is colder at planting are going to benefit more from starter fertilizer. So while soil temperature is going to influence crop management is also going to influence soil temperature. I'm almost stating the obvious here when I say that soil that's exposed to the sun, that's exposed to the wind, is going to warm up quicker than soil that's shaded and kept moist, where evaporation rates are low. And so things like residue management and tillage are going to strongly influence soil temperature. Another way farmers can manipulate soil temperature, in a matter of speaking, is by their selection of planting depth, right? The depth of seed placement in that soil. Generally, the deeper into the soil profile, the colder it is in terms of temperature. And so by planting, shallower versus deeper, farmers are manipulating the soil temperature that seed and that those seeds are experiencing. So I do quite a bit of agricultural research in Northern Ontario, and when I speak to farmers from that area, some of them tell me that they will seed shallower than what is recommended, at least in Southern Ontario. So they won't seed as deep as their compatriots down south, and they do that in part to manipulate the soil temperature that their seeds are experiencing. A frost event is defined as any time when the air temperature drops below 0 degrees Celsius, when that temperature is taken at 1.5 meters above the ground. And that's important, 1.5 meters. That's kind of a standard, universal standard in the world. That's the height at which air temperature is taken. And the reason why we standardize 1.5 meters is because often we have temperature gradients, and it gets warmer the higher up you go above the soil. Remember that cold air sinks and warm air rises. And so while the definition of a frost is temperature at 1.5 meters, it can be a lot colder, closer to the ground where a plant can be growing. Frost-free period has a pretty simple definition, and it represents the time available for a crop to be grown for agricultural purposes. In Canada, the frost-free period is never greater than 8 months, and in most places it's much less. For example, in Ontario, the frost-free period is normally 6 months or lower, depending on where you are in the province. And so our limited time available for crop growth means that globally Canada is considered a limited environment for crop growth. The frost-free period just places a much larger limitation on cropping system productivity when measured on a per year basis. Most agricultural areas of the world have a longer frost-free period. I know Professor McAuliffe already touched on the effect of frost damage on crop plants already, but I figured I'd put this slide in just for a quick review. I wanted to also touch on the phenomenon of crop hardening. So as many plants, not all, but many types of crop species are exposed to lower and lower temperatures, they will harden or become acclimatized to those lower temperatures. And they do that by accumulating solutes like proteins and sugars in their cytosol of their cells to protect against ice formation. So I just want to compare and contrast the hardening process of two different crop plants grown in Ontario. So let's start with alfalfa. If it's hardened, it can experience temperatures down to -14 without without frost injury. And unhardened alfalfa can only experience down to -6. So the hardening process is very important for alfalfa. Now remember that hardening is reversible and dehardening can occur in alfalfa in wet soil conditions. So now let's look at soybeans and more specifically the seedling stage of soybeans. And I'm specifying seedlings simply because in Ontario it's probably the most likely growth stage for soybean to experience a frost event. Late frosts in May are not unheard of in many parts of Ontario, and so soybeans that are emerging, out of the ground, experiencing a frost event, not all that rare. So just comparing the temperatures that it can withstand, either hardened or unhardened, it's clear that soybean is much less tolerant to frost than a crop like alfalfa. There are different kinds of frosts that occur, and they're distinguished by the exact climatic variables that happen to coincide and create the frost. And a lot of that depends on, for example, the relative humidity of the air when it's cooling, and etc. So you don't really have to know anything about that for the purpose of this course, but I just want to point out two different types of frost damage that often occur in Ontario, and these are indeed photos from Ontario. So on the left you see white frost, and this is actually ice crystals forming on the outside of the leaves. And here, this type of frost might not actually damage the plant, depending on how quickly the air temperatures warm up. This kind of frost might be harmless or nearly harmless. On the right, you can see what's called black frost. And here there were certain species in this cover crop mix that were much more susceptible to frost damage and they died. And black frost, you can see yellow parts of the plants, and you might be able to see black parts of the plants. That tissue is dead due to the cold temperatures. And so, with white frost, damage may occur, but black frost, the damage has already occurred. So the effect of air temperature on the G&M components of cropping systems has already been covered indirectly and directly previously, but I want to bring your attention to that last bullet point, the use of fall-planted versus spring-planted varieties of cereals. And let's just talk about wheat for a second. So winter wheat versus spring wheat. So in Eastern Canada, winter wheat is much more common than spring wheat. And conversely, in Western Canada, in the prairies and the Peace River Valley region, spring-planted wheat is much more common than winter wheat. And why is that? So we know that in winter the prairies experience much colder air temperatures compared to Eastern Canada, right? That's going back to a slide I showed you previously. We also have much more precipitation over the winter months in Eastern Canada, and winter precipitation is essentially snowfall. So we have more snow over the winter in Eastern Canada. That snow acts like a blanket for the soil and for the crops right growing in the soil. The air temperature of the soil in the winter is always much colder than the soil temperature in the winter, and it's because of that blanket of snow that's protecting that crop as well and keeping it slightly warmer. In the prairies, there's less snow, and so that snow blanket is less effective at insulating those crops from the air temperature. And because the air temperature is so much colder in the prairies, it's much more likely that a killing temperature, a lethal temperature will be reached, killing that winter wheat. So there are a number of ways that farmers will manipulate air temperature to ensure that their crops, do not experience a killing frost. And these are typically expensive measures that are only taken in high-value crops, horticultural crops, tree fruit, and so on. I know Professor McAuliffe already touched on these, but I figured I'd go ahead and talk about a couple of them. I know some apple farmers in Ontario will hire helicopter pilots to fly over their fields at specific growth stages if they're expecting or there's a risk of a frost. And again, that's just to better mix the air. So the warm air is rising and the helicopter flying over that field will push that warmer air down and bring the colder air up. There's also, I've seen in Spain use of heaters. Believe it or not, I've seen wood stove heaters essentially in orchard. Frost fans are also used in Canada. It operates on the same principle as that helicopter, just pushing the warmer air that's rising down into the crop. And also overhead irrigation and sprinklers, so watering that crop, not on the soil, but misting that crop. You're essentially adding heat in a thermodynamic sense, because as that water freezes, it's going to be releasing heat, and that heat is going to prevent the crop, the plant tissue itself, from freezing. Another thing farmers can do is select genotypes that are taller, so fruit trees that are taller, for example, that set their fruit higher up in the canopy. And so again, because we have this gradient in air temperature, there is an advantage, a small one, but it could be the difference between life and death of a fruit being set higher up above the ground, where it might experience slightly warmer temperatures.